I recognize most of you. Oh, and we are recording this just for future use, but we have a quick poll. If you could just share where you're joining us from or what neighborhood you call home, that would be great. So I'll leave it up for a few minutes. Looks like Dilworth is well represented. One more. Okay, great. All right. Okay, and you can see Dilworth, well, someone from Wilmore. We just really appreciate everyone coming. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn my video off while I'm presenting, but I'll turn it back on so we can talk face to face and answer any questions at the end. But I'm just going to walk through the presentation. Let's see here. So for the design standards, again, you're muted. We will unmute you when it comes time for the question and answer. And there's also the raise your hand tool. So if you would use that, if you have a question, you can also put any questions in chat. Candace and Cindy are here with me, and they are helping to monitor the chat. But we're just going to go ahead and get started. I'm Christy Harpst. I am the program manager with the City of Charlotte for the Historic District Commission. I just mentioned Candace and Cindy. Candace and Cindy are planners with the Historic District Commission. And we've been working with the neighborhoods and community for the past 2 years on these. So the agenda for today is we've done the introductions. I'm going to share with you a quick project timeline of where we've been, overview of the changes, and next steps. And then we'll end with question and answer. So it should only take about an hour, maybe sooner, depending on how many questions we get. And of course, we're glad to extend this and stay a little late if we have lots of questions. But just starting with the project timeline, we've been working on these since 2019. And the HDC has had a lot of retreats, business meetings, and where all of our retreats are open to the public. We welcome everyone attending. We have a lot of times there have been people from like the Dilworth Land Use Committee that's attended some of our retreats, but we've been talking about these in public forums since 2019. The ones in February and June of 2019 largely focused on Oakland Park and mid-century guidelines. June 20th, 2019, we did talk a lot about multifamily because that was, a hot topic here with the commission. And you can just see all of the meetings that we had. I do want to clarify for Oakland Park, because they are a new district that we're glad to have join us back in December of 2020, so not quite a year ago. We adopted their standards already. So the Oakland Park standards have been adopted, and they were adopted on March 10th, 2021. And those have been incorporated throughout this document. For a while, you will notice on our website, we have sort of a working document for the Oakland Park standards, but those have all been integrated. Just walking through kind of chapter by chapter of what we've changed and updated. The first thing is chapter 2. So one thing I want everyone to know, if you're joining us, there is a provision for staff to issue an emergency certificate of appropriateness. So does natural disaster, fire, we've had a couple of fires recently, trees falling from storms, wind damage, anything like that. If something like that happens to your house or your building, call us, because we can usually get something back out to you within 24 hours and let you get right back to fixing your house or building. So that is something I wanted to point out. We have incorporated that into the guidelines. We've updated our chart. Again, if you look at nothing else for our guidelines, and you're wondering where to start with a new project, start here, page 2.9 and 2.10. This chart is in our existing guidelines. We just made some small edits and clarification about what staff review, what's full commission review. Not any substantive changes, but just making things clear. The chart is not exhaustive, but it is a starting point to help people with their projects and understand what review path they are on. In chapter three is about the building, the architecture, the neighborhoods. It's about the history and development of the established local historic districts. We added the new information about Oakland Park, again, is woven into that. We've also added new information about building types for multifamily and commercial. So we've updated our map to show Oakland Park. On this page, on the right-hand side, are the 3 pages that represent the architecture, the map of the neighborhood, the development history of the neighborhood, and incorporated that into chapter 3. Chapter 3, again, has also been extended to include multifamily, both historic and new examples throughout the districts. We have triplexes, we have duplexes, 1-story, 2-story, quadruplexes. So this is just to capture a sampling of what's found throughout the districts. Again, anything shown in chapter 3 when you're looking at housing types. So at the top of the page where you see the black and white line drawings, those are, it's not exhaustive, right? These are examples of what's typically found. You might own a property that looks different, but is a multi-unit property. Same with commercial. You might own a commercial building that's not represented here. This is just a sampling of typical buildings that you see in the district. Again, on these pages are historic buildings and new infill construction for commercial. In chapter 4 is the rehabilitation of building elements, and we incorporated commercial. We wove that in throughout this chapter. Same with mid-century resources, wove that in throughout the chapter. The example I'm going to show you is just one example. It also talks about, I included the roof example because we added some things about solar. People have been asking for more direction on what they can do with solar panels, skylights, satellite dishes, all those things. So we've added that information to roofs, but this is just a representative page showing how we've woven in the commercial guidelines to the rehabilitation of building elements chapter. We have also added things, if you look at the top of the page under number 4, I have it underlined. We added some explanations and educational notes where we could to help people understand when they're going to repair their historic roof, what to look at first, especially when you're looking at slate. So we added that where we could. We have a new section in chapter 4, rehabilitation. Again, chapter 4 is rehabilitation of building elements. And with the advent of Oakland Park joining us and with adding commercial structures, we now have awnings. So some of the mid-century resources have awnings, and they also use different materials than found throughout Dilworth or Wilmore or Plaza Midwood or Westland Heights. So we have this new section on awnings. We also included a new section on historic storefronts. So again, it's representative of various forms of historic storefronts that you might see in Charlotte. One thing to remember is that we have very few commercial form buildings currently designated. So one thing that these guidelines or standards are looking at is looking forward into the future. Every couple of years, something comes up from Plaza Midwood to Central Avenue. It's not gotten anywhere, but since we know that those conversations keep coming up and there might be an opportunity for either a commercial district there or elsewhere that is the commercial form, we've included storefronts. Chapter 5 is historic materials and treatment of historic materials. And we updated it again throughout to include commercial elements. We also added a new section on murals. Again, murals, this has been asked for by a lot of our, again, commercial folks. So we had a project in Wilmore on South Mint Street where they're redeveloping some old industrial and commercial buildings, and they really wanted to do murals, but we just don't have guidelines for that. So this has been at the request of a couple of different folks, and just we needed something that covered murals so that we have standards for the public and for the commission on how to evaluate those. The key with murals is it's not changing our guidelines on painted brick or masonry. That's still just a no-no in historic districts. But what it does is provide maybe some alternatives. If you do have an unpainted building and you want to put up a mural, it tells you how you can accomplish that. Chapter 6. So chapter 6 and 7 are our biggest changes. Chapter 6, we talked about this at all of our retreats over the past 2 years. And we found that there was some confusion over having additions being its own separate chapter, because an addition is inherently new construction. So to eliminate that confusion, we've consolidated the additions into chapter 6. The standards for additions have not changed. We added a diagram for mid-century buildings, but that was it. Nothing has changed to the addition guidelines. The changes to chapter 6 include all residential buildings. So residential buildings, whether you're single family or multifamily. We have a new section on context and how context is looked at and evaluated. Because if you've been to the commission recently, you know they're always talking about context and making sure that new construction, whether it's infill or an addition, it fits within the context. So there's a section on that I would encourage everyone to look at. We also have diagrams that show how things are evaluated. The one difference that we talked about is the difference between a single family house and multifamily structures. And multifamily by its nature is larger and more complex than a single family building. Sometimes it's parcels that have been assembled to create a larger parcel, so more multifamily units can be built. One recent example I'll give you is the 325-331 East Boulevard. That project was 2 separate parcels that they assembled to be able to build a large multifamily project. And by its nature, it's bigger than the single family houses that have transitioned to a commercial use on East Boulevard and has greater impacts on the neighborhood. So the difference in treatment is if you are single family, your context is primarily what you see standing on the sidewalk in front of the house. So that's C here on the slide. So if you're standing on the sidewalk in front of this vacant lot and you want to build new, your context is what you see on the street. Multifamily, again, because by its nature, it's larger than single family. It's often a combination of parcels. And it's often on, it's not usually mid-block. It's often on corner lots. It's often on the edge of a district. We're seeing it a lot with the redevelopment again on East Boulevard, some on Kingston and Wilmore. And so A, B, and D show what's considered context for when you're doing new infill multifamily. The changes that we made to the existing guidelines for new construction was to incorporate more specific guidance for multifamily. and a lot more diagrams. So you can see with setback, what that example is showing about how you have to not only consider the setback for the main street, but also the side street when you're on the corner. For spacing, it's still the same. Let's keep some spacing between the buildings. Orientation, there's an example of a new cottage court infill. And then massing and complexity of form, we've included an example of a successful new multifamily project over, it's called Kingston on West. It's in Wilmore. This should be familiar to those of you who have submitted to the commission before. At the top left of the page, height and width. This is a new diagram. This is basically an illustration of what our Zotwall surveys are. So the Zotwall surveys are critical for making sure that new infill fits within the surrounding context. And they provide a lot of valuable information for decision making, looking at foundation heights, eave lines, window header heights, how the ridges line up, and just to make sure that the proportions of what's being proposed for new construction align. So this was, our attempt at putting in that Zotwall survey to make it really clear how that's looked at. Nothing much changed as far as examples, exhibits on scale, directional expression, or foundations. There's some new information about multifamily and scale, as well as I think roof form and materials number 8 is new there. But in general, again, it's just weaving in the multifamily to make it more clear, because before we only really talked about multifamily in that introduction section. We also looked at where people were getting confused in implementation. One thing we see a lot is requests to use what we call the pork chop eave. That's at the top right corner. So we just put a picture. So this is not what we're looking for, along with the pictures that what we are looking for. And that's the only change. The only change is just to show, hey, this is what we're calling pork chop and what we're not looking for. Doors and windows, not much changed. Again, weaving in Oakland Park guidelines throughout this as well. And they have different materials than in Dilworth, Wesley Heights, because they are a 1950s, 1960s development. They have a lot more metal, for example, in windows and in doors and in porch railings, porch columns. Not much changed here with porches. Again, a little more clarification for multifamily about just using examples of existing structures and how those are treated. Materials, again, what I just talked about with windows and doors, talking about how Oakland Park might be a little different because they are a different vintage house and building than the rest of our districts have. Here's what I alluded to earlier. This is the only change to the additions. We just added information from Oakland Park and showing these housing forms and just the variety of additions that can occur there. Chapter 7 is totally new. It is all about commercial buildings, and it includes examples, from Fourth Ward, from East Boulevard on Dilworth. The biggest challenge that the commission wrestled with at our public meetings and that we held with our design consultants was that there are 2 commercial forms in Charlotte. You have the commercial corridors that used to be residential. So the East Boulevards, part of Park Road, they used to be residential areas that have transitioned into commercial. So you have that residential form that's now in a different use, and trying to figure out how we can respond to developers' questions about what they can do and increase the square footage of their businesses without impacting the buildings. And then you have the more traditional historic commercial form, like on South Mint Street with Pasta and Provisions in Wilmore, or you have a little further on South Mint and Westwood with some of those more industrial commercial buildings. And again, this chapter is also forward thinking. Like I said, we have constant, every couple of years we hear from Central Avenue and Plaza Midwood. Every couple of years we hear from NODA. So this is just looking forward and incorporating this now in the event that we would have a much larger historic commercial area in the future. Context is included. The format of the commercial chapter is the same as the format of the residential chapter. It has all of the same headings. The examples and the specific standards are applicable to commercial buildings. So what I just mentioned, that the Dilworth commercial areas are much different than some of the ones found in Wilmore and even the ones found in Fourth Ward. And it was a very specific request from property owners along East Boulevard and along Park Road, how they can make use of those front porches to expand their office space. And it was heard by the commission. So in those uses, there are guidelines or standards here that allow for the enclosure of front porches to capture more square footage. And the example shown on this page is one that's done really well and a great example to follow. So again, all of the same things that are in the residential section. You have setback, you have spacing, orientation, massing, and complexity of form, just for a commercial setting. I'll point you to setback and spacing. So we have two examples because again, we have those two different on the ground circumstances of the East Boulevard corridors, the Park Road corridor with the residential form, and then the corridors that have a more traditional commercial form. So there's different setback and spacing on each of those. And again, everything's about context and what corridor, what area you're within. Height and width, scale, directional expression, foundations. Again, same categories as residential. A little more complexity with doors and windows and the added guideline for storefronts with commercial. Commercial also has some different materials than especially a more traditional commercial buildings that are shown. They might have different window configurations. They might have a lot more metal, especially if you get to roofs. They have flat roofs, which might have a membrane roof, which we're not used to seeing a lot of that in our residential areas. There's a section again on additions for commercial buildings. And then some of the other changes were done in chapter 8. This is our private sites chapter. We made updates throughout to incorporate commercial elements. And this is just one example. This is probably the page that changed the most in our private sites guidelines. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner, that's what the previous page looked like. It was all focused on residential. And now we've transitioned to a mix of residential and commercial, because we know that parking is a huge issue, especially for commercial properties. We don't regulate parking. It's whatever's allowed by zoning, the underlying zoning. The only thing we regulate is where it goes. So we're not going to tell you how many spaces you need or anything like that. We're just going to work with you on location and screening and lessening any impacts of parking to our corridors. A couple changes on landscaping and lawns, and this was just to incorporate, again, Oakland Park, and also incorporate recent requests and from community members. We've had a lot of requests recently for treks or alternative materials for decks. In the past, that has been sent to the commission because the staff can only have so much power. We can approve what the commission says. We can approve at the staff level. The commission has approved a couple of projects with treks on horizontal surfaces only. And so we incorporated that in the guidelines. So any of these standardized practices that the commission has started approving at the request of property owners, we've incorporated into our chapters. Another page that's just expanded a little bit. Again, it's practice and it's what we do now. It just hadn't been written down in the guidelines as explicitly as it is now. We decided to clarify and expand on certain guidelines for fences and retaining walls. So for example, number 8 that's circled goes with the new diagram. And this is what we have required for fencing for as long as I have known the commission. That it can be 6 feet in the rear yard, it has to step down along the side yard, and 3 feet in the front yard. But we've been sending out a similar example when we're talking with applicants one-on-one, and we thought, hey, let's just include this example in our standards so that we can point them to a page and it's really clear on what's required. If you have a side entry, right? I mean, obviously this is an example. This is about halfway down the house. It steps down from 5 feet to 4 feet. There are obviously, like with all of our standards, there are individual conditions that might not quite follow this exactly to halfway, but it's a starting point for discussions, and staff it can work with applicants on fencing. The other thing that needed clarified was the picture over here of the fence with the shrubs. So we said our current guidelines just have this picture and it says fences should be landscaped on public elevations, but that's all it said. What the commission standard has been what we added to number 10. You need a planting strip, and the planting strip actually needs to be able to support the plants. So 6 inches probably isn't enough. 18 to 24 has been the standard. So instead of just having kind of this vague picture, we spelled it out, what the standard is and what has been asked for. Same thing with retaining walls. We're just spelling out the standards that have been for recent decisions and projects of the commission and of staff. We changed accessory buildings slightly. Part of this was to accommodate Oakland Park. So the picture at the top, they have these really cool modern carports built like 50s with a flat roof, but they have gable roofs. So one thing I will point you to, I didn't underline it, but number 3, what our former guidelines said that new outbuildings should be compatible with the style and character, especially in scale, massing, and roof form. We eliminated roof form because that doesn't really go with Oakland Park. And because to allow for maybe some more room for modern forms of roofing for sheds or garages and rear yards. So we just clarified that. We clarified what we meant by secondary. So it's because secondary felt too broad. So secondary height, footprint, scale, massing. So that would refer people back to those specific design standards for new construction. We also are constantly getting questions about what constitutes an accessory building that staff can approve versus what is something that has to go to the commission. And it's been a real judgment call of staffs based on visibility and height with the clearly secondary. So we talked about, let's just set specific parameters. If you meet these parameters, chances are your accessory building can be staff approved. So it's less than that 24-foot high zoning maximum and 2 feet shorter than the primary structure. If you're 2 feet shorter, we're pretty much considering you secondary to the main structure. We added some lighting. Again, this was in response to input from the community. While we can't regulate what Duke Power does in public settings, if it's on, individual property owners, if you have adding floodlights, adding the temperature of the light, those things were added. So about security lighting, temperature, and downward directed to help with the dark sky compliance and to also help prevent, blinding everyone. And then the last thing is sign standards. Nothing changed in signs. We kept the same guidelines. We just consolidated the heading. So urban districts, commercial, office, anything basically non-residential is one. We kept industrial the way it was. We kept our multi-tenant. The only things we added were non-conforming signs, and this was to come into compliance with the new sign standards that zoning adopted, as well as historic signs. And again, those are to come into compliance with the sign ordinance updates that zoning recently adopted. And lastly is the timeline. I've talked about the timeline at the past couple of commission meetings. We are just getting started with public input. So we're extra appreciative of y'all being here today and providing some feedback on the standards. Our next public meeting will be November 4th. It will be an evening meeting to hopefully capture some of the folks who couldn't meet us at lunchtime today. We'll have a public hearing before our HDC meeting in November. So around 12:30, we're going to have our public hearing and more input from residents. It's welcome. We'll leave that public hearing open. I've highlighted December 1st. That's the final day for the public to submit comments. We have an online comment form. It's very open-ended. So it just asks for your name and your email and your contact information so we can get back to you on things. But please use that too. If we have a question today that you don't feel comfortable asking, or you have a thought later after this meeting's over, go to our online form and submit any thoughts or comments or questions or clarifications, and staff will get back to you. We also have our general HDC email address, which will be on the next slide. Write that down. It's monitored by all staff. Our tentative plan is to vote to adopt at the December 8th meeting. Of course, that is all dependent on the public input we receive on the public hearing. If we need to push that, we will, because we want to get this right. And that's all I had. Here's the email, the all staff email. Myself, Cindy, and Candace all check it. And then there's a link to the draft document. We also have just a page on our website dedicated to this. So I'm going to turn my camera back on and we're going to open it up to questions. Let's see here. Okay. I can screen share again, actually. And then if we have specific questions, we can go back and talk from whatever slide you want to talk from. I see a familiar face. Hi, John Friday. Candace, Cindy, you can unmute everybody. We have just a few people with us today. I think we can do all of these. Let's see here. Let's see. There we go. I see John is unmuted. Hi, John.
Hello. How are you?
How are you? I'm doing well.
Fine.
How are you? Thanks for joining us.
Nice presentation.
Thank you. We'll, after, I didn't mention this, but after our next public meeting, we'll put this up on the website too, so everyone can look through it as well. Anybody have any questions? Oh, hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Good to see
Good.
you.
I have a whole page of questions, but I will probably just email you most of them. So
Okay, sure.
Ask
And
a couple key ones.
that's actually perfect. You know, if you have lots of questions, we're glad to talk with people one-on-one as well. So if you want to ask a few, we can always set up a time to talk through some other questions.
So the first one was about the example you used for 325 and 331 East Boulevard, where
Sure.
we're wanting to make sure we keep buildings I guess, separate on separate lots. We're not really allowed to, combine into one building.
Oh, not necessarily. Not
Okay, well,
necessarily. Yeah.
That's why I was looking for a little bit more guidance on that, because,
Sure.
in this presentation, you show 525 East Boulevard. So would something like that still be allowed today, where it is the width of 2 lots? That lot was already 1 lot when they developed it, because it was an apartment building before.
So right. Yeah, it's just, this is, the design standards they're standards, and we can't write them to fit every single scenario. So yes, every lot's going to be different. Every situation's going to be different. These are general guidelines to help you or anybody start planning a project. I think the East Boulevard example is great. Let's see here. I gotta find it. I must have, you know what? I know where it is. It's in the examples, multifamily examples. There it is. It's right here. Yeah. So it has a break in the building. It goes in and out to give the relief of, the large structure.
But so that is essentially the same corner, just 2 blocks down from the 325 East Boulevard townhomes. So I'm just trying to understand if that today, I think the way the guidelines read now, that 525 East Boulevard would not, if 325 wanted to do that same building, they couldn't have done it. Am I understanding that?
I don't think so. Yeah, and that's hard for me to answer, right? Because the commission is a commission of 12, but I think by including these examples of what has been done in the past really well, like, of course, that's an example of what could be done in the future.
Okay.
The same thing could apply, Jennifer, to, if you look at the bottom left, that's the Grandin townhomes in Wesley Heights. So those are really big structures, long-wise, but there's a lot of in and outs. There's a lot of separation in the facade. There's so many front porches, and they made a real effort to relate it and step it down to the quad on the corner. That was a requirement. So this was a 2015, 2016 project, and I use it a lot in trainings that I give to the Civic Leadership Academy on how a project changed from when it was first presented to the commission to the final approved project. And when this project was first presented, it turned its back on the community and looked in on itself. And I can send you that slide that I share, and how the commission was like, no, you need to relate it to the buildings around it. So step it down and relate it to this historic quad. And it was super successful.
So Christy, I have a question.
Yes, sure.
Is the historic district in these guidelines only dealing with residential buildings? It also deals with if the building is non-residential, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So Jennifer's point, I think, has a further, it's going to be, the UDO is going to make it a little more difficult, and that is the UDO allows, at least currently proposed, non-residential buildings to be up to 300 feet in length. And so I think that section you were just had on screen,
so let's see here,
that talked about how a building is visually made to be split up one back.
Well, so that would be, I guess, instead of commercial, to your point, maybe we should call it non-residential, because residential is the multifamily, right? Or single family.
And see, commercial is non-residential as opposed to being commercial, because the word commercial in the UDO is going to have a very specific meaning.
What? That's a really good point.
Which is a furniture store on Independence Boulevard. Not in the historic district. So if you could back up one slide.
Sure thing. There you go.
I'm just thinking about this totally on the fly because of I thought, excellent question. If you look there at the project that she called an address, 5 something on East Boulevard.
Right
Yes,
here, this one. Yes.
if we want buildings in the historic district that are non-residential to be broken up more than a 4-foot offset, but I mean truly made to look like separate structures that cover along site, you might want to take a little of that element right there and put it onto the non-residential page.
Okay.
That, I mean, in my personal view, a 300-foot long building in the historic district is inappropriate, period. And there, whether it's brand new or not. And so the historic district could have its hands tied if it doesn't have a little more in the non-residential side that allows that scale and massing to be dealt with. That's my point. I'm not sure where.
Yeah, I think we should probably look at 513, 515, 517 South Mint Street. And if you will bear with me, I will pull that up on Google.
Okay.
Let me stop sharing, because this is exactly to your point.
Trying to think where that
15 South Mint. There's a picture of one of them in the guidelines or in the standards for commercial. Let's see here. Okay. Oh, why is it so? Okay, here we go. Share my screen again. Okay, are y'all seeing a Google map?
Yes.
Okay,
we're seeing images.
So this building right here, this is like 515, 513, 515, 517. It is a really long building. And as a matter of fact, I think a building is missing, perhaps, maybe not, in between, but there's a parking lot.
Right.
So I would want to know, this is historic. This is a historic building. If you zoom in, you can see it has all of that historic glass for the windows. Now, there's been a lot of changes, but it is a long building that it's pretty flat. It doesn't have, the ins and outs because it was built in sections. So this one was the earliest. This building was built a little later. And I think this was tacked on at some point. And then as you move down, this is probably the oldest building. So there are examples where it doesn't go in and out, but I think the difference is that the size, scale, massing, right, of this historic example, it doesn't go in and out, but it's only one story. So those kind of like balance each other out, right?
Yes, it's also different materials. It has a sense of being built over time. The windows are different. The, one you might say is 1920s and next is 1930s. The way the UDO deals with this is the assumption it's a brand new building of a totally different scale. And they require, I think it's either 10 or 20 feet, no flat wall more than 10 or 20 feet. And at every 100-foot element, you have to step it back 4 feet or something like that. So they are thinking about an entirely different scale building. So if HDC wants to have a little more control over when that lands in the middle of the historic district, I think this is a good example. And I think Jennifer's questions about how that's dealt with, maybe just a little more thought on that since the UDO is coming.
Thank you. This is the exact feedback we were hoping to get today. So thank you both. I think we have someone in the chat, maybe.
I don't see any.
Oh, it's a direct message. Okay, I'm going to read it for everybody. John P. This is John. John does not have a webcam. John, do you have a microphone? here we go. Can you, negative, okay, okay, thanks. Yes, glad to talk to you afterwards. A little bit more about density and height restrictions for new construction. Definition of historic building, great question. Section 6. Okay, so the definition of a historic building, it's in the back. Our definition is broader than the National Register. The National Register, ends at the point in time when the National Register listing was written, and it doesn't allow for new buildings to age in. So our basic guideline is 50 years old or older is considered having significance to the district. A lot other things we look at, if it's not older than 50 years, was it built by an architect? Is it contribute somehow to architecture, history, cultural history, social history? It may not be the prettiest building in the world, but maybe someone really significant to Charlotte's history lived in the building. Eric Lemieux, you're up. Can you unmute yourself? Oh, perfect.
Yes, I
Hi,
can,
Eric.
Christy. Hey, good to see you guys.
Good to see you too. Thanks for
I appreciate
joining
it.
us. Yeah.
So I actually had a couple notes, and I figured
Sure.
it could be good to possibly ask some of these questions while everyone is here, just for insight. Because I think there could be a lot of good perspectives taken from everyone's different backgrounds. I think the most interesting changes could be possibly made to these multifamily projects, because I think, it could certainly be very sensitive to still maintaining and preserving the integrity of these historic districts. And I know that's why there's probably so many opportunities to make sure that, that different perspectives are taken. I think, reviewing the draft documents, the one item that stood out to me was the topic of context and trying to, especially for larger projects. And I know it's such a delicate item. I don't know if you wouldn't mind just elaborating further on context with multifamily buildings, especially if you don't have like a similar land use, given that a lot of the projects are small, or a lot of the historic structures around, a new multifamily site might be much smaller. So I think any additional clarifications or guidance would be really helpful for the development team. So, the development community could present higher quality projects for the commission on first review. And I think a lot of that just comes down to selecting the appropriate context, if that makes sense.
It's really site specific. That's the tough thing that's the importance of context. So I'll give you an example. We have seen multifamily. There was a new townhomes built in Plaza Midwood right off of Thomas. I can't think, is it Kensington maybe? And it was built to look like a quad, but it is 2 townhomes. So, it fit in with that smaller context, and it was mid-block on Kensington. It fit in with the surrounding structures. But then East Boulevard, so Thomas Avenue and Plaza Midwood is so different than East Boulevard and Dilworth. So it all depends on the project site. We, like everything else, we encourage applicants to meet with staff early. We'll help you figure it out for your project. This is a starting point for figuring out your context. And a lot of it is to lessen the impacts, like you said, with the single family residential around it. We understand that these are going to be bigger buildings, right? Multifamily is just going to be bigger, and it can be done. But what are some ways that you can, lessen the impacts to neighboring single family? So, for example, the example I gave earlier on East Boulevard, they fronted East Boulevard, and it's much taller, bigger buildings on East Boulevard. But then as you get into the neighborhood down Euclid, and as it steps back just a little, like it's not drastic, it's not a lot, but it tapers off in the back to provide that kind of step down and that gradual change to relate to the houses behind it. So get with me. context is tough. It really is site specific. And this is a start. The other thing I'll say is guidelines are a living document. As you can see, we updated these completely in 2017, but they're always changing with requests from the development community, requests from homeowners. The example of being able to close in front porches on East Boulevard was not something that was even considered in the 2017 update. But because of project requests that we've got on Park Road and other things on East Boulevard, and it's a real, where's the line with struggling with how do we protect the buildings, allow them to change and evolve with their use to accommodate modern uses, and not be so strict that it's eventually going to end up in a demolition of that building because they can't maybe make use of their front porch for that extra office space. So this is a living document, and these are new guidelines for commercial multifamily. They are things that the commission has been implementing in their current reviews. So the Van Landingham townhomes, they looked at it the same way with these examples. The 325 East Boulevard, it's just putting into paper how they've been making their decisions and how they've been evaluating projects so far.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Christy. I guess my follow-up question to that would be
Sure.
HDC overlapping in TOD transit areas. And I know certainly the code is currently written that a lot of the exterior features override, other ordinance requirements. But how is that looked at from, I guess, TOD areas? Because TOD is kind of looking to push density, but then at the same time, historic districts, we're trying to be cognizant and supportive of maintaining historical integrity. So it almost seems like they're kind of two conflicting goals and objectives.
I couldn't agree more.
so do you have any like guidelines or best practices for making sure that both are balanced appropriately, so you're still meeting the intent of both goals but still being respective to the historic district?
So the simple answer is, when it comes to zoning, the most restrictive applies. Historic district is more restrictive. If there are areas that historic district is silent on, a great example is parking. We don't regulate parking. We don't say how many spaces you have to have, but if you have it, we just make sure it's designed properly and cited and screened. TOD talks extensively about parking, depending on the use of the building. So whatever they say about that, anything the commission, our guidelines standards are silent on, that goes. It's really no different. It's been the pet overlay was the other thing. So on East Boulevard, was there pet overlay on Mint? It might just have been East Boulevard, but that was the same. Pet overlay allowed for a lot more as far as height goes, as far as, other things go. But since this is more restrictive, that applies. There's a map on, have you been to Charlotte Explorer? It is okay, good. It is a huge resource as far as showing where the different overlays are. There are areas at the edges of Dilworth up to Worthington, Cleveland, across East Boulevard. Parts of East Boulevard are in PED, which PED is going away, part of the UDO. And then there are some other, is it Rensselaer maybe might have some of the overlay on it. John Friday, I see him shaking his head. Yes. John Friday might be the person to ask, or Franklin, because they have looked at this at a parcel by parcel level. There's some overlaps there. There's some overlaps in Wilmore on South Mint and Summit. And there are also, NODA is not a local district, it's just National Register, but it does impact some areas of NODA as well. John, I might turn this to you too, to talk about what you and Franklin have been working on separate from us, or if you have any thoughts, but my answer is most restrictive applies. So that would be HDC and that would be context. So the earlier in project development you get with us, the better.
Yes,
Thanks
I
so
want
much, Christy. I appreciate
to say to Eric that there are many of us who argued that no historic district property should have been in Todd, but we were assured that with the language of the historic district and its guidelines, that it would make sure anything that was still designated Todd would be appropriate. So that is the conflict that you see, and it was intended to be the conflict that we have. But Christy and her group do a wonderful job, and I thank the commission in looking after that. Are you talking about the text amendment, Christy? You were saying what Franklin and I
Well,
worked
I mean,
on, or
I
parking,
just
or
in general with how you've been working on this since the beginning with Todd, when Todd was first introduced, right?
yes, back in the dark
Yeah.
ages. Yes, there was
I
an
mean,
original
Todd's been going on forever, right? Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, we have Todd because of the transit that we have, and we put the transit where we did because the rail lines were there, and Dilworth, in fact, helped speed all that in the 70s, and maybe we should get our money back and not do it. But that led to this conflict. But I think that as long as the HDC exists and are given the abilities that they have, it really is a difficult marriage, but you can do both. Christy did a great job explaining. Todd covers lots of things that Historic District does not touch at all. So those are givens, but what HCC touches, it has control over. And so it becomes a balancing act. Franklin, anything you want to add? I mean, Franklin's the president of ECA.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty accurate. And I think as we see some of these activity centers, the regional activity centers and community activity centers that are currently in the policy mapping of the Comp 2040 plan, I think we'll see some other conflicts. But as long as the HDC is there, obviously the more restrictive will take precedent, and that's kind of what we're counting on.
Christy, I have a question.
Who is that?
Scott Ray.
Oh, hi, Scott.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. I had a question about 6.2 context, which deals with the different context between single family and multifamily.
Yes.
I obviously have a myriad of issues with this, but the question I have specifically is, do you know if the legal counsel for the HDC has explored the legal liability as it regards to fair housing with the overt discriminatory nature and disparate impact it causes? Do you know if they've looked at that?
We don't consider, the only way we consider use is, are you a single family or are you multifamily? Sure. Other than that, we don't get into anything else.
Sure, but discerning the difference between context, which is, I think in fair housing, might be argued that you can't discern, the context is not different for the two. Have they explored the legal liability of the disparate impact it causes?
So I can definitely check with our legal on that. But we're looking at building form, and there's
Sure.
lots of legal protections and court cases that have upheld the use of historic districts and historic overlays to guide new development. But I am certainly glad to run that by that question by legal.
Okay, thank you.
Someone else popped up. Franklin, did you have something? No, okay. Your video just came back then, okay. Anybody else? Any other questions? We're right at 1 o'clock. Again, Cindy and Candace, if you would put that general email in the chat and just send it to everybody, I can go back to that at the end. Let's see. Here's our email if you have more questions. We're glad to talk with you one-on-one. John might reach back out to talk a little more about what you brought up. But yeah, thank you all for taking time out of your day. It really means a lot. You guys are the historic districts. We are administering this for the residents, the property owners, and everyone, all the other stakeholders. So thank you. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Christy.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks,
Y'all have-
Christy.
Y'all have a great day.
Thank you. Great job.
You too.